Today's episode is sponsored by Datadog, the cloud scale monitoring service that provides comprehensive visibility into public cloud, hybrid cloud, multi-cloud environments with over 250 integrations. Datadog unifies your metrics, logs, and distributed request traces into one platform, so you can investigate and troubleshoot issues across every layer of your stack. Use Datadog's rich, customizable dashboards and algorithmic alerts to monitor cloud migrations in real time. To start a free trial today and Datadog sending you a free t-shirt, visit datadoghq.com/cloudcast to get started. That's datadoghq.com/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios. Aaron, it is good to be back doing shows with you again. It's great to have you back on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I got to do kind of the solo show last week, which was the first one in a while. And I had to also remember how to publish a podcast, which was pretty entertaining behind the scenes for the two of us. But yeah, now and we're getting to do both Cloud News of the Week as well as a show together this week.
Yeah,
as well,
you've been busy with work stuff, and then last week you were out at Azure. So we're going to dive a little bit into Azure sort of after we do Cloud News of the Week. But yeah, you were out at Azure. You did the show last week, and so we're gonna dive into that.
Lots of great stuff coming out of Ignite. Lots of good stuff to talk about. But yeah, let's hit the big cloud news first. So there's one big story in particular we should probably talk about, right, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. I went back and looked. I was kind of looking through some old news stuff. So as of 2016, Microsoft had purportedly made a bid to buy Docker for $4 billion, and here we are. 3 years later, Docker actually got acquired here. Actually, sort of an interesting thing. So Docker, the part of Docker that was maintaining Docker Enterprise or Docker EE got sold to Mirantis for an undisclosed amount of information. Or an undisclosed amount of revenue or dollars.
Yes.
So, wow.
Where do we start?
I mean, there's a part of me that looks at this and looks at the parallels to like WeWork, and goes, man, what unbelievably inflated expectations, and sort of how fast things crash. It was. I mean, we were going to DockerCons in 15 and 16, and I think we went in 17, and I mean, the world was, it was the old joke. You went through every keynote and you got drunk because it was all Docker. Yep. And then it just stopped. It's the craziest thing. I'll give you my recap of sort of what I think happened to Docker, and I'll try and be as unbiased as possible because I obviously my day job sort of competes against it. They built a massive community. They did an incredible job of using containers easy. They basically invented the usability of containers market. They built a ton of developers. It was all about, hey, we're all in this together. And then overnight they just said, you know what? We need to start making money, and we're going to own the trademark. We're not going to keep accepting requests from they basically sort of, I don't want to say shot the hostage, but they basically told the open source community, like, yeah, you figure it out on your own. We're going to make all the money in the community. And it just stopped at that point. And Kubernetes came along and sort of took over.
Yeah. And if nothing else, take the technology completely out of it for a second. It's a cautionary tale of building a community, building an open source model, and then all of a sudden, what happens when it's so successful and somebody has to figure out how to monetize it? And it felt to me like the monetization strategy wasn't in place because, and again, this is how far back we go on this show with it. We had Solomon on when it was .cloud.
Yeah.
And so, it was this thing that, we kind of built this original business and this one tech, and then you spun out this tech, and then this tech gets super big, and then you get a community around it, and everyone goes, oh crap, this community is so big, we have to make money off of it. Then what? Right. Yeah. And this is just a postmortem on how maybe not to do it.
Well,
I don't know. That's maybe going a little far.
I think I mean, there's always going to be lots of hot takes and things on it. I mean, I think I think this is sort of if anything, it's sometimes there are things that we learn or patterns that we've seen, and we believe that certain patterns will repeat themselves, right? So, back when we talked to them as .cloud, I mean, they were a PaaS offering. So it wasn't just the container stuff. It was like the developer experience. It was everything, the scheduler, the packaging, everything. And then it just became a feature. And then what happened was they brought in a bunch of people like on their VC board, like Jerry Chen, and they brought in some ex-VMware people to be involved. And I think they thought, oh, we're going to replicate the VMware model, right? And that was when they sort of went from, hey, everybody uses containers, which is analogous to VMs. I mean, you remember all the, hey, containers are going to destroy VMware sort of thing. And what they hadn't figured out was, the reason VMware made all their money was not because it was VMs. It was because they built the management plane. They built all the management tools that you absolutely had to have that VMware admins loved. And they'd never figured out, how do you monetize that, or how do you create such an awesome experience around it that people are, that want to pay you for it. And I think what happened was they waited so long to then kick in the sort of VMware model that, there was a ton of different companies who had then figured out like, okay, we need containers, we need to schedule some stuff. Kubernetes was sort of this beginning to become a thing, and people quickly went, oh, okay, if we collectively as a community work together in some other direction, they can't do the VMware model. And so I think part of it was timing. I think part of it was, they probably thought they had brought in some people who had, built infrastructure software as their VCs. And so they were going to lead them in the right direction. And I bet if you went back and watched like the Cube from 2016 and 15 and even 17, I'm sure there were people going, man, you built this amazing community. How are you going to monetize it? And it was always like, yeah, we're working on it. We're working on it. And you can only go so long before it's like, I got to pay the bills. I gotta be able to get people to think there's value in paying for this.
No, I completely agree. And it's a fantastic assessment. The other thing I would say too, though, I think we knew even back then, though, the valuations and the money they were pulling in were crazy.
Oh, yeah.
Like we all, no matter how big it got, I think behind the scenes, everyone was kind of going, they got how much money? They're worth how much? That doesn't make any damn sense. Well, and so it's one of those, it's like you were just waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah, I think and valuations are always a hard thing because I think people have a tendency to sort of sometimes value stuff and they put the number into something that they can think of. Like I see this all the time where somebody's like, man, $10 million is a lot of money. And you're like, relative to what? Like how much money you make or relative to like how much your car is? But like, the guys over at the Software Defined Talk podcast made a sort of an interesting comment. They were talking about this and they said, yeah, a $4 billion valuation probably seemed crazy if you were like Microsoft, if that actually happened. But at the time, I think VMware was a $40 billion valued company. And so, if you put it in the context of like, hey, you could get in for 10% of VMware, and own that and take over this market, like that, maybe in those terms of numbers, like wasn't a crazy thing. I think that the thing that people misunderstand, and they still sort of misunderstand this with containers, is like VMs didn't make you change the application. They just said, we will take cost out of your application. Like that was the value of VMware. Containers, I mean, yes, you can lift and shift a Linux application to a container, but it doesn't magically make it distributed. It doesn't magically make it sort of cloud native. And I think people vastly underestimated like the change in who you're selling to and the change in what had to happen to get massive numbers of applications in containers, right? And we're still seeing that evolve, but look, so the other half of this, so Mirantis did buy Docker. They essentially bought the assets and the people that were Docker EE. The other interesting thing was there is still a company called Docker, right? So
they got $35 million in funding.
They got $35 million in new funding, and they now own the Docker sort of developer tool. So that's the other part of this is very interesting. Like, I don't know how many people are still at regular Docker. Is it 20? Is it 50? Is it whatever? Because $35 million won't last very long, depending on how big it is. And they still own things like Docker Hub and stuff, which is, that thing has a huge hosting bill, Right. So it'll be very, very interesting to see what Scott Johnson, who's the new CEO, used to run marketing, has planned. I would love to see the slides that they put in front of the folks that gave them $35 million as to how they're going to monetize it. Because we get back to the original question: how are you going to monetize Docker?
Yeah.
So, anyways, that's sort of a long, winding one Cloud News of the Week episode, but we thought that would be a kind of a good one to have for this week, because it's we may have to come back at some point, maybe at the end of the year, and talk about kind of, how did the sort of cloud native and computing space get to where it was, given what everybody thought Docker had a way head start on years ago.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Yep. So with that, we are going to wrap up Cloud News of the Week, and then we are going to jump into kind of reviewing the announcements from Azure and Microsoft Ignite. Today's Cloudcast is sponsored by our friends at The Cyberwire. If you have trouble keeping up with the latest cybersecurity news, we recommend The Cyberwire's daily podcast. Each day, they give you an informative 20-minute recap of the latest and most important updates in the industry. They keep their content concise, accessible, and relevant, separating the signal from the noise in an industry overloaded with information and competing messages. We here at the Cloudcast, we listen to stay up to date every day, and we think you should too. So subscribe to the Cyberwire today. You can visit thecyberwire.com/subscribe or search for The Cyberwire, CYBERWIRE, in your favorite podcast app. And we're back. Aaron, it's just you and me today. We are going to. You were out at Microsoft Ignite last week. How was the event? You and I really haven't been to a lot of events, especially doing podcasts, in a while. We've been to a few, but we haven't really ever been to the Microsoft Ignite event. So how was that in general?
Yeah. So first of all, it's my second or third Ignite now. And it was actually a fantastic show. A lot of people. It is, crazy. It's not on the, AWS reInvent level of crazy, which is probably 4 times bigger at this point. But it's crazy in the fact that it's, like when you go to a VM world, it's our people, if you will, right? It's like people in our industry who are focused on technology. It's practitioners, it's architects. When you go to something like Ignite, it is, hey, here's the Azure stuff. Oh, here's the Xbox as well. And here's all of the, everything else. Like it is such this big, conglomerate of technologies, some of which you're going to care about, some of which you're not going to care about at all. I will say this though, the show felt more upbeat, the same way like some VM worlds were really good in the past and some VM worlds you could kind of tell was a down year. The Ignite show in general felt really, really good show floor, lots and lots of vendors. Something Microsoft did this year, which was fantastic, which they had this whole podcasting area. They had 5 studios set up and you could sign up for them. And so we actually did the show. Last week's show was for one of those. And in talking with them, they actually had recorded 140 either Microsoft shows or community shows about the event or about a technology at the event. I mean, that's pretty freaking impressive.
Wow.
Because, just that pure stat, it was like just this machine to just turn out podcasts. So that was really interesting. And I would encourage everyone to go listen to that. And so it was a fantastic event overall. It is nice for us personally, being in North Carolina, to actually have an event in our time zone. So it was down in Orlando, Florida, as opposed to having to do the trek to Vegas or San Francisco or Barcelona or somewhere else. Yep. So it's nice to have the one show a year that seems to be in our time zone, which is also really nice.
Yep.
And a lot of really good announcements. And that's probably what we should dig into next.
Yeah,
as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess just for the sake of people listening in, like you said, Ignite covers a really broad set of things for Microsoft and for Azure. So it obviously, it's sort of all cloud-based. So it's all going to be about Azure to a certain extent, but it's also going to be things like Office 365 and some of the things that you would lump into there. We're not going to cover those so much. I mean, there was a lot of announcements. We'll put some links in the show notes, but we're not going to talk about the latest, thing that's a feature in Word, right? We're gonna mostly focus on the cloud stuff. So if you're at this point and you're going, oh man, cool, they're gonna tell me about Slack or the Slack competitor, we're not gonna hit on those. We're gonna hit on the cloud stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to start with Azure Arc?
Yeah, let's talk about Arc. So it's interesting. 3-4 years ago, Microsoft announced what was it called? Azure Stack, right? So
yes,
so you even going back a number of years, you sort of had the differences between like AWS saying the only thing that is cloud is the public cloud, and in their world it was AWS. And Google sort of said the same thing, and then Microsoft said, nope. You know what? And again, this is because they had a lot of on-premises, enterprise, mid-sized customers. They said, we're going to figure out a way to blend the Azure public cloud with something that you're going to want on premises. And they used to have Azure Stack. They just announced Arc. And I believe, the best I sort of understood it, Arc kind of becomes the next generation replacement of the sort of offering that is Azure plus Azure Stack. And now it's rebranded as Arc.
Yeah, it is. And I'll actually take it one step further as well. So it is exactly that. But it's also, there's this larger trend. So again, we'll compare and contrast AWS and Azure in all of this. AWS has, for the longest time, it was, hey, there was no such thing as private cloud. There was no such thing as hybrid cloud. There is no other clouds. It's only our cloud. Their message has softened over the years, especially as they're trying to get into the enterprise, to where AWS is like, okay, we recognize that people might have, on-prem. We recognize people might, want to do hybrid cloud or private cloud, but they're still us. We're still the public cloud.
Right.
Azure Arc takes a different approach in that there is a multi-cloud world. Azure is willing to recognize there's a multi-cloud world. You can actually say the words multi-cloud, and you can actually refer to more than one cloud. And they do directly in this. And what this almost is a bit of a management control plane to manage, of course, Azure and Azure Stack, but also manage other services in other areas, whether it's, on-prem, whether it's hybrid cloud, whether it's other public clouds. And so it almost becomes this, we want to be your operations control plane no matter where you are.
Right.
And so the idea is like, I want to make sure I get the operations aspect of all of these no matter where you are, because you probably will do this app in this cloud or this app on-prem or whatever. And so that was the other thing that was super fascinating to me, is how drastically different Microsoft's message at the event was from what I predict AWS's message will be here in a couple of weeks at reInvent.
Yeah, I think I think we will see a big splash about Outpost from AWS, and I think part of it will be because we've now seen Google has Anthos. They sort of rushed it from beta and alpha late last year to the spring. It was all of a sudden GA. And they're saying, hey, we'll manage on-premises, at least some subset of on-premises, our cloud. And then they start saying, hey, you can put stuff in other people's clouds. We'll manage something of that. Arc felt sort of similar to that. This thing of like, I know you think, companies will say, hey, we want to run in multiple clouds, and they're going to manage that. It's still not completely clear to me. Like, I get it when you say, hey, I have my software or /hardware in the cloud and on your premises. I get that. We manage sort of like to like. It's still not 100% clear to me how they're going to cleanly manage stuff in other people's clouds, especially if they're trying to hide what the other clouds have to do, the pricing. And, so I suspect what we'll see from that, and I think we're already seeing that kind of from Anthos, is like, those are sort of futures, and they're sort of putting them out there as PowerPoint for now. Maybe there's a demo somewhere, but they're kind of like, let's see how much people really want this. But let's not completely cut that off, because that gives us a way of positioning ourselves against AWS.
Yeah. And the other thing to consider when we do these kind of control plane overlays is, what do you manage to? Because
right.
Do you have to manage to a lowest common denominator, and you end up neutering some of the very specific features of each of those clouds or services? Or do you like, okay, I'm an overlay and it's one common interface, but you can go super deep on all of those, which requires a super, super tight level of integration, because you're trying to abstract away the problem or the complexity, but at the same time offer that complexity.
Right.
And so it becomes we've seen both attempts in the past from different products in this world of almost like manager of managers, if you will. And they always tend to fall in one bucket or the other. And I don't think we've really seen which approach this is either.
Right. Yeah. The other thing I noticed, and I didn't get a chance to listen to sort of the whole keynote. I kind of got the snippets part of it, but I did pick up that Satya Nadella, at least in the keynote, they sort of went out of their way to say, hey, we are still essentially, we want the relationship with us and our customers to be kind of very pure, right? Microsoft and Microsoft's customers will have a vendor customer relationship. And that's like, we think that's very important. And they were sort of, without explicitly calling it out, saying, hey, look, your relationship with other people that are cloud providers are likely going to be complicated because the parent company of those cloud providers, whether that's Alphabet or Amazon, is very likely going to get, at some point get into a lot of your businesses, right? And I think they've realized like that's another thing that they want to continue to be harping on, because it is a reality, right? Like there was an announcement this week. It was really low key. It was kind of under the radar. But Google basically is partnering with, I think it's JP Morgan, it might be Citibank, and like a credit union in California to basically say, hey, we're in the banking business now. We're kind of, we're going to start doing some stuff that gets us in the banking business, right? We've seen Amazon get into groceries. We've seen Amazon do other stuff to get into healthcare. And that worries companies, right? They kind of worry about what's their relationship with these technology companies.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And the other thing I was going to add too is I also think this approach, fits in, although I haven't seen anything yet, but I'm just kind of predicting where this may go next. The other big Arc play is because Microsoft has such a mature partner and enterprise customer business compared to the others. Don't get me wrong, AWS is growing and AWS is, multi-billion-dollar run rate and all of these other things. But at the same time, it just doesn't approach the partner ecosystem and enterprise account maturity that a lot of times Microsoft just has those tentacles in because it's super mature and has been there for, 20 plus years. I could see this Arc also being, a bit of a play for a lot of the channel partners and others that are out there of like, hey, we can do this assessment. And oh, by the way, we've got this product that'll improve your operations and all of these other things. So I could see this growing in maybe non-traditional cloud ways, but very, very traditional enterprise sales play ways.
Yep, definitely. I mean, that is another sort of huge advantage that Microsoft has is just enterprise experience, right? They've worked with those customers for a long time. We see Google trying to hire like crazy to sort of ramp up to that. Amazon has been relatively good at that. The other thing I thought that was sort of interesting about Arc that I think is sort of in the real category was back in the Azure Stack days, they made a big deal about saying, well, Azure Stack is software, and we're going to partner with sort of the 4 or 5 leading hardware server vendors to deliver that. And that sort of created this sort of weird thing of, well, is this a Dell EMC thing? Is this an HP thing? They basically, branded they branded an HCI product. They branded a stack, sort of a rack of equipment product. I think they've basically realized in order to be successful at this, and this sort of follows the AWS Outpost model, you really probably can't do it if you're relying on these sort of non-cloud hardware vendors to be under the covers, right? They're another bottleneck to making the deal happen. They're another piece of friction between you and the company. It'll be very interesting to see how much traction that gets and how they're able to leverage, sales, financing, other stuff without having to involve a sort of a secondary or third party. I think that sort of flew under the radar, but I suspect that will be bigger than, that'll be a big deal.
Such a good point. I got another one to move on to if you're ready.
Yeah, let's do it.
Next one. So the other one that was super interesting for me was Cortex, and it is almost like a bit Office-y, but it's in the Office 365 portfolio. But what was really interesting to me was a couple different aspects of this. First of all, it is a new offering in the Office 365 portfolio. So it's not just Word and Excel and SharePoint and all the other things that are, the things we're used to and have been there forever. And quite frankly, was just an extension of the on-prem software that was, moved into the cloud. Cortex is this idea of it's an AI-driven, take all your data, like let's say there's a bunch of data in SharePoint, go look at all that data, apply a bunch of algorithms, and then come up with data tagging against it. So it is a little bit of like, how can you go find the needles in the haystack because, man, as somebody who's been a SharePoint user in the past, and even, don't get me wrong, at Google Drive as well, like anytime you get these big, large organizations and everyone's trying to store stuff on, the file share somewhere, it's always like, where the hell was that? What folder did I put that in? And how did what did that look like? And so it's an additional way to do tagging and discovery, because as data continues to get centrally stored in one place, it gets harder and harder to find. I actually didn't see it at all, didn't see a demo of it, but I just, read a bunch about it, and I was like, oh, wow, that's super interesting to me, because it, this idea, of course, who I've worked for these last couple of years, data management and data classification and data governance and compliance. This is all things that I kind of live and breathe every day. So that really hit my radar. Yeah,
this is a problem space that it's sort of the mousetrap that keeps coming back every 2 or 3 years. Everybody goes, hey, enterprise organizations are big and complicated, and collaborating across them is really difficult. Like, if all of your information could somehow be, cross-referenced, if you will, right? Throw AI on it, tag it, whatever.
Right.
Like, we could make better decisions. We could find knowledge workers. IBM tried to do this 10 years ago. Cisco tried to do this because they had all these, communication systems and phone systems. I was involved with some of that. Google, I'm sure, tries to do it if they have you for Office. And it makes perfect sense. Like, Microsoft should be very, very good at this. I think they've had multiple tries at it. And and I think this is another one of those things where, they begin to see stuff like Slack happen, and, they try to do Teams, and, it's like, oh man, that potentially becomes a central place where you collaborate. So we need to be tapped into that. So I think at the end of the day, if you went to various office workers and knowledge workers and so forth and said, like, hey, would you like sort of recommended stuff? They'd be like, yeah, probably. And then what ends up happening is it's always like, the long list of, yeah, but what about, is my boss going to know that I'm spending too much time? You get into these sort of like weird privacy, creepiness, HR, and these systems just never seem to take off. But, maybe this one will figure it out, because it's, it's got AI behind it. They sprinkled some AI on it.
Right. Sprinkle some AI on it. Right. Yes. AI washing is going to be the next thing. Right. Well, the other thing I would add too is, as you got, GDPR taking over, and you've got the California privacy laws that's, probably going to pass here before too much longer. And once that passes, we'll probably see some other states, or maybe even nationally, more privacy laws here in the United States. But this idea of, combination of what happens to my information internally within your organization, combined with how many copies of the data are. Of course, hey, I can get removed from production copies pretty easy, but what about all the test dev copies that you took my data to, do test dev against? Or what about the offsite copies, backed up somewhere else? So there's this idea of can help with the data sprawl concept of like, hey, the little AI runs in the background and starts tagging everything. And so when it's time for compliance of like, how many copies do you need? How long do you need those copies? Go get rid of all those copies. Like, that is something that could be helpful from an organization standpoint, and could help with the, what I believe is probably the impending privacy acts that are coming. But to your point, it's only as good as the AI, right?
Yeah. But that's a really good point, because at some point, these systems always kind of, up until now, they'd always kind of been, pitched as, they're going to be great for your organization. People were, the end users were always like, I don't know. It's like, I'm doing okay.
Right.
And they were probably very hard to cost justify, because it was like, do you want all this extra stuff for the chance that, maybe you'll figure out, the one cool idea? But you get the GDPR stuff where it's like, hey, I can put a distinct value of a lawsuit of information being in the wrong country or doing the wrong thing, or like maybe it becomes a sort of security / compliance / regulation thing. Then you can start putting some numbers against stuff, because people know what fines look like versus they know what systems cost. And it may just become something that you just kind of have to do, right? It was sort of like, if you're a public company, you have to have systems that do SOX and accounting compliance. This just might be, part of the way this thing gets pitched, right? So that'll be an interesting angle. And sometimes everything in technology is timing, and maybe, between GDPR and some of the US regulations or other ones, the time will now be right for something like this.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, the last one I had on my list was, and this is where Ignite, and I think Microsoft's still trying to figure this out, is there's a bunch of stuff going on with GitHub and Microsoft and Azure that are sort of floating around that don't always get the most press unless you really are super involved with the GitHub community. But we're seeing more and more interesting things where, essentially, we've talked about serverless a million times, and you go, okay, well, serverless is like, okay, it just runs your code. You don't have to worry about all the other stuff. And we're starting to see more and more of GitHub, starting to do some things. They call them look it up. It's like GitHub functions or something like that. But it's basically, or GitHub events. It's, essentially them being able to go like, well, your code's here and we have all this computing resources here that keep track of stuff. And like, maybe we could just sort of start beginning to be your edge, sort of serverless thing. And you start to think about that and you go, man, they have all this code. If people could start doing that, I think we're going to begin to see, and this is something we should dig into more and more, like the sort of synergies between Microsoft and GitHub and the things that you can do, really, really close to your code. This may be an edge thing. It might be, an IoT thing. It might be, some other type of thing. I think there's a lot more there, and Microsoft and GitHub are trying to figure out how do they do it in a way that doesn't make everybody feel like we've locked you into Azure, right? Like they do, but they don't. And that was sort of lightly touched on in the show, but it doesn't really come out as a big bang unless you really live in sort of the GitHub coder world. Yeah, no, it's such a good point, because this larger idea of how do you monetize something without them feeling threatened. And the only way to really successfully do that I've seen so far is to your point, have some way that just completely reduces friction, that it's like, oh, I could just, click this or just integrate this, or it automatically does this, and I don't even have to think about it, right? And this feels like the baby step in that direction of figuring out, okay, what are they willing to do, or what are they not willing to do? How does this feel to everybody? I completely agree. I think this is the first step towards some of those larger things. And I'm sure there is somebody really, really smart that has a big plan of how we're going to see all of this or how we're going to integrate all of this. But yeah, this feels like a first step, and time will tell. Yeah, and we definitely, if there's some folks, if they're listening and they've got good contacts over at GitHub, we would love to dive into stuff with them much, much more. So, reach out, let us know. We think there's some pretty interesting stuff going on there. Well, listen, man, I think we're going to wrap that up. It's good to have you back. I know you're going to be getting back involved a little bit more with the podcast here, because you're going to have, potentially some free cycles to work on it. But great to kind of recap Azure. Great to hear that that community is doing well. Obviously, they're probably super excited after winning the big the Jedi contract for $10 billion. So probably a little bit of bravado. But yeah, completely. And there is, and I'll just mention this too quickly. It may or may not see the light of day. We'll see. But Greg Neerman has a podcast over at NetApp, and you were the honorary first guest. Yeah, absolutely. On the podcast, and I actually recorded a podcast with them when I was at NetApp Insight, so their conference the week before Ignite. I recorded that there, but and it was specifically about Jedi. It was super interesting, super fun. But also, I'll be completely honest with you, we recorded it in the morning when the show floor was super loud. I don't even know that audio is usable. So quite frankly, it may be a really good podcast that was just lost to time. So we shall see. Yeah, we will. We'll put a link in the show notes for that. So, all right, folks, with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you to everybody who listens, who tells a friend, who ranks the show on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. And with that, we're going to wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.